welcome. Hope you enjoy what I'm going to talk about. I need my glass of water, although a glass of wine would be better. Start with water. My lovely assistant, Magana. I'd like to thank Simon McGinnis, the head of the Cuban Solidarity Group, for organizing this evening, as well as the rest of the trip I'm on in Ireland, and for being so supportive and a good friend. And I'd also like to introduce the Cuban ambassador to Ireland, Teresita Trujillo, who I'm sure you know, and I thank her for coming as well. So tonight we're going to talk about my second book. It's called Cuba Under Siege, American Policy, the Revolution, and Its People. And the idea, which Simon has touched on, was to examine how American policy has affected Cuban society, the culture, the economics, the society, and the individual. And I like talking to Cuban individuals. I've been to Cuba many times, and I think the voice of the individual Cuban, the average Cuban, is as important as any other voice coming out of Cuba. The first book was based on nothing but oral testimonials from Cubans who were victimized by terrorism. The second book is an examination of how American policy has affected Cuban society since the revolution began. And I did interview a number of top-level Cuban officials, as well as the average Cuban on the street, to get a picture of, well, just exactly how the individual sees themselves in context to the Cuban relationship with the United States. And it was quite interesting. I'm not sure the exact percentage. 75% of the Cuban people born today were born after the revolution. So they know nothing other than being under American hostility. So what happens is they internalize this perception. They don't perceive America as being a constant influence in their day-to-day life because they've not just accepted it, they know no other existence. So a number of Cuban officials said it's hard for even Cubans, average Cubans, to understand the effect American policy has had on Cuban society and the economy because there's nothing to compare it to. The older generation who knew Cuba under the Batista regime and under the American control, they can see what American policy has done to the attempt of the Cuban society to develop and advance. But the average Cuban, the majority of Cubans, have nothing to compare it to. So it's even one of the greatest successes of the siege is to convince the Cuban people that the siege hasn't had an effect. So you talk to Cubans and say, well, yeah, but the problems that we're dealing with, our shortcomings, are all the fault of the government. Well, it's easy to blame the Cuban government, and the Cuban officials have said they've made mistakes, but they're trying to improve things. They're trying to advance their society, which makes it really hard, makes it harder when you've got the world's greatest superpower with an anvil over your head, waiting for you to make the littlest mistake, and that anvil will come down and crush you. So every decision the Cuban government has made, national policies, international relations, in some concept, in some way or another, has always been considering how the Americans are going to react to it. So it has an effect. It has a really debilitating, retarding effect on the Cuban government's ability to advance their form of socialism, to move into the 21st century. So the book examines various aspects. It starts with the history, which to me is fascinating, with a lot of people it's boring. The history between Cuba and the United States, you have to understand that. If you look at Cuba, if you're interested in Cuba, you have to understand the relationship historically between the United States and Cuba. And it goes way back to the 1820s, when the Monroe Doctrine said anything in our backyard is ours. So the Americans considered the Americas as their backyard. And Cuba, a long time ago, was considered to be part of the Americas. It was just a matter of time before the United States would own Cuba. And they had the chance in the Spanish-American War, the Cuban Second War of Independence in 1895, when the Cuban national revolutionary forces fought the Spanish colonizers and were 3 years into the fight and they were winning, and then right at the last minute the Americans came in and said, okay, we'll give you guys a hand, we'll pick up the Spaniards, thank you very much. The Cubans said, yeah, come on in, we want your assistance, but we'd like you to leave after you've given us your assistance. Well, the Americans stayed, and they exercised hegemony over Cuba for 60 years until Fidel Castro, and the revolution triumphed January 1st, 1959. So that set the stage, because the Americans were totally dumbfounded. They said, well, how can the revolution be against us? We brought you so many good things. We're a benign imperial power. In fact, we don't even recognize that we're an imperial power. We're just so good. And the Cubans said, well, yeah, but we want our own country under our own terms, and we're tired of you guys running things. And there's a whole history of how the Americans directed Cuban society, Cuban economy, Cuban culture, the Platt Amendment, all sorts of historical books you can read about how America controlled Cuba. So Fidel and the revolutionaries said, you know, we'll do it our way. So the revolution was against American interests. And those who left Cuba, those who opposed the revolution, were those who supported American interests. Not just Americans, but a certain segment of the Cuban population that had political, economic interest and influence in support of the American hegemony. So they left. And it was very, very shortly after, in fact, even before Fidel took power, but it was very shortly after the revolution triumphed, that the American official government policy was regime change. They had already put Fidel in a slot. They had already called him a certain political name, and at that time that was the worst thing you could call him. This was way before the Soviet Union and Cuba had any official relations. This is way before Fidel announced the revolutionary movement and socialism. The Americans had already decided that Fidel had to go, and it wasn't based on politics, it was based on obedience. Because Fidel said, no, we're going to do it our way. And the Americans said, well, Batista's a bad guy, but we want to put a Batista light in, just because he'll still be under our control. And Fidel said, no, there's no middle ground. It's extreme. We are going to take our country back. So Fidel could have been whatever political influence you want to say, it didn't matter. It was really convenient to call Fidel a communist because that was the worst thing you could call someone in the United States, especially if you're 90 miles off their coast. So the Americans said, Fidel's a communist, he's got to go. So how are you going to get rid of a revolution that's supported by 90% of the people? Well, you make the people suffer. You make things so bad for the people that they'll rise up and overthrow their own government. You can attack the government, you can try and direct your anger at the government, but your real strategy is to hit the people where it hurts. And there is specific American truth. April 6, 1960. So put that in context. You're talking January 1st, 1959, the Revolutionary Triumph. April 6, 1960, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-America Affairs, Lester B. Mallory, wrote, "The majority of Cubans support Castro. The only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship." And in case that wasn't clear enough, in the 1970s, a CIA officer explained that the continued economic embargo was only in place because we wanted to keep bread out of the stores so that people would go hungry. We wanted to keep rationing in effect to keep leather out, so people only got one pair of shoes every 18 months. So the average Cuban who is suffering economically, who can't get enough bread to eat that and the shoes on his feet, he's living the reality on the ground in Cuba, and it's easy to say, well, the government's not giving me enough food to eat. Meanwhile, it's the American policy to do everything in their power to make things so bad for the Cubans that they'll say, I don't care whether we support the government or not, we have to change things because anything would be better than what we're dealing with now. So there's the mentality of how the Americans tried to create a siege against Cuba. And in many ways was effective. A siege, the perception of siege is you have one castle, one island, one area, totally surrounded. No one can get in, no one can get out. It's not entirely true about Cuba, because Cuba was trading with the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc. And in the first couple of years of the revolution, they were trading with Western democracies. Well, the Americans instituted their economic embargo. And then they realized, well, that's not good enough, because even if we don't trade with Cuba, so many other countries are. So now we have to hit the other countries to prevent them from trading with Cuba. And they went after Latin American countries, pressuring them with threats, with promises, with whatever it took. If you're dealing in the late 50s, early 60s, the American influence in Latin America was much stronger than it is now. And then they approached England, Canada, Western Europe, and said, you can't trade with Cuba anymore. Because if you do, all your aid is cut off. Or if you trade with Cuba, you're not going to be trading with us anymore. Britain had an order of a number of fighter jets, and the Americans said, fighter jets that were going to sell to Cuba, and the Americans said, no, you don't. You're not selling anything to Cuba. So from 1961, there was like 500 ships from Western Europe and democracies coming into Havana port. Cuba revolution was still dealing with countries, including the Soviet Union. That was 61. By 63, there was like 5 ships coming into Havana port from the Western democracies. So the Americans put so much pressure on their allies and every other country to stop trading with Cuba. And it was very effective. So then Cuba says, okay, well, I want to trade with Britain. I can't, because the British won't trade with us because of the American pressure. I want to trade with Canada. Can't do that. So then the Soviet Union steps in and says, well, you have extra sugar, we'll buy. Started trade relations with Cuba, no problem. So the Cuban revolutionary social aspects coincided with a number of the Soviet Union policies, but Fidel always wanted to maintain non-alignment. He was a promoter of trying to move Cuba in its own separate path. His options became much limited when the American siege started to take place, when the only option was, I'm going to trade with these people, and these people want to trade with me, and we're going to have good relations. So then the Americans set up conditions where they persuade other countries not to trade with Cuba. Cuba starts trading with the Soviet Union. The Americans forbid arms sales to Cuba and forbid any other country to buy arms to Cuba. The Soviet Union says, well, we'll support you militarily. The second that happened, the Americans said, aha, look, the Cubans are buying military weapons from the Soviet Union. These darn communists, they're off our shore. Look at the danger Cuba's presenting with us, because they're buying weapons from the Soviet Union. Well, no one says, you know, we're not selling them anymore. We're not allowing anyone else to sell weapons to Cuba. So Cuba has the right to protect itself, and then the Soviet Union supplies them. And in fact, one of the American officials said, this is exactly what we want to happen. We want to make sure that the Cubans can't buy weapons from anyone else, only the Soviet Union, and the second they buy weapons from the Soviet Union, then we can classify them as a danger to Western Hemisphere, which is exactly what happened. And that all gets back to American strategy of siege. So the economic component is the most important, the most obvious, and the most effective. You starve the people, you know, they're going to look around for something else, regardless of whether they support the system or not. But that's only one aspect of it. There's so many other elements of America's siege. The first book I did, Voices from the Other Side, talks about one of the elements that is completely unknown, and it's the history of terrorism against Cuba. The Cuban government has documented more than 600 acts of terrorism, has resulted in the deaths of more than 3,500 Cuban civilians. These are acts only in Cuba. There are other bombings and other acts of terrorism that have taken place outside of Cuba, Montreal, Toronto, Miami, New York. The book I did, the first book, was only on Cuban civilians inside of Cuba. Most of the acts of terrorism were conducted by Cuban-American organizations based in Miami or Southern Florida. Not all of them, but a segment of Cuban-Americans turned violently against the revolution. A lot of them were under the knowledge of the American government, and some programs were developed by the American government. Operation Mongoose. From the Bay of Pigs invasion, after the Bay of Pigs invasion of April 1961, to the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, the American State Department ran a terrorist program called Operation Mongoose. Hundreds of acts of terrorism, hundreds of civilians killed. I'm not going to go into details, but that has an effect on society, and it has a greater effect when no one else knows it. The Cubans know it. Outside of Cuba, forget it. It's an unknown war of terrorism. And it's unknown because the American government denies, refuses. They control the message. And controlling the message is another aspect of siege. If you've only heard bad things about Cuba and you've never been to Cuba, it's pretty obvious your perceptions of Cuba are going to be negative. And that's exactly how the Americans control the message through their own people. The American propaganda systems are very effective. So for 50 years, since the start of the revolution to now, the American message is the predominant one. Havana's voice is invisible inside the United States. And when it